Think for a moment. Is there anything more fascinating than the stories of forgotten empires, of civilizations that shaped the world without our knowing? Iran, or ancient Persia, is not just a country. It's a portal to time. Many see it today through lenses distorted by headlines, geopolitical tensions, or a veil of mystery. But behind all the controversy lies one of humanity's richest and most dramatic sagas, a story that challenges everything you think you know about the East. Prepare yourself for a journey that begins in the ancient sands where legendary kings erected colossal empires, passing through the splendor of Persepolis and the dramas of the 1979 revolution. But this is not just a sequence of dates. It is a living narrative. Today, in January 2026, Iran is going through one of its most critical and decisive chapters. While we delve into the past, we cannot ignore the present. The nation that faced bombings of strategic installations in 2025 and now sees its streets filled with a population clamoring for survival and freedom. This story is proof that a people's resilience can overcome centuries of turbulence. But today, that resilience faces its ultimate test. What is happening now in Tehran is not just politics. It is the newest and most urgent gasp of a civilization that refuses to stand still in time. The air of Persia is dense, laden with the dust of millennia, whispering tales of empires that rose and fell, of prophets and kings, of poets and warriors. But make no mistake, today's Iran is not merely an echo of its glorious past, nor the simplistic caricature often presented to us. It is an intricate tapestry, woven with the shimmering threads of an ancient culture and the vibrant colors of a modern, yet complex, and sometimes misunderstood nation. When we think of Iran, what comes to mind? Deserts stretching to the horizon, mountains touching the sky, ancient cities whose stones hold secrets from forgotten eras. Yes, all of that is true. But Iran is also the effervescence of its metropolises, the fervor of its faith, the resilience of its people, and the geopolitical tensions that place it at the center of a world stage. It is a place of stark contrasts, where modernity intertwines with tradition, where the silence of the desert coexists with the bustle of ancient bazaars. On one side, the majestic ruins of Persepolis, silent witnesses to a power that once dominated vast portions of the known world. On the other, the silhouette of mosques, whose minarets echo the call to prayer, punctuating day and night. It is a country that defies easy definitions, an enigma for the unwary observer, a treasure for the patient scholar. Its landscapes, from snow-capped peaks to sunny beaches on the Persian Gulf, are as diverse as its people, whose gazes carry the wisdom of generations and the hope of an uncertain future. In this land, myths and reality merge, legends and tenderness mingle, creating a narrative that is both universal and uniquely Persian. Prepare yourself, for this is not just a history lesson. It's a journey through a land of mysteries, an ode to the persistence of a people who, against all odds, continue to write their own saga. We will delve into the depths of time, uncovering the layers of a civilization that shaped the world in ways you may never have imagined. It will be an expedition beyond the headlines into the soul of a nation, long before the colossal empires that would dominate the Near East, long before the legends of Cyrus the Great echoed through the valleys and mountains. The land we know today as Iran was already teeming with the pulse of human life, a cradle of civilizations that rose from the mists of prehistory. Here, in the fertile plains between the rivers and mountains that guarded the vastness of the Iranian plateau, the first communities began to take root, their settlements punctuating the landscape with the colors of life in contrast to the monochromatic desert. We are talking about eras so remote that they blend with myth, with the time when humans lived in harmony or in constant struggle with wild nature, forging stone tools and discovering the secrets of fire and agriculture. Archaeological evidence tells us stories of Neolithic villages, such as Tepe Sialk, where the first Persian farmers began to master the land, transforming it from wild and untamed into sustenance. Their adobe houses, their rudimentary pottery, their first communal tombs, all this speaks to an incipient social organization, of a community learning to live and thrive together, family and tribal ties being the first foundations of a complex social structure that would one day dominate the world. As the first rays of sun kissed the Zagros Mountains, the nomadic tribes who had roamed these vast lands for millennia began to settle down, attracted by the promise of abundance offered by cultivated land. It was a time of slow but profound discoveries and innovations. The domestication of animals, the development of metallurgy, the creation of rudimentary irrigation systems. Each step was a revolution, moving humanity away from mere subsistence and laying the foundations for something grand. It wasn't just survival that drove these early inhabitants. It was also the search for meaning. Their beliefs, their rituals, their artistic representations engraved on rocks and ceramics. All of this spoke of a profound relationship with the cosmos, with the forces of nature that governed their lives. Mountain spirits, river gods, fertility deities. The pantheon of their beliefs was as vast and mysterious as the very land they inhabited. They were the Proto-Iranians, the Elamites, the Caspians, peoples with names that today seem like distant echoes of a forgotten past, but who, in their time, were the builders of a vibrant culture, the first to leave their indelible mark on the soil that would one day be the heart of Persia. They learned to shape copper and bronze, creating weapons and tools that distinguished them, elevating them above their neighboring peoples. While the plains of Mesopotamia saw the rise of Sumer and Akkad, and Egypt erected its pyramids, the Iranian plateau nurtured its own civilizations, absorbing influences but developing unique characteristics. These early cultures were not isolated. They exchanged goods and ideas with their neighbors in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. The sounds of merchants, the clinking of copper coins, the mingling of foreign languages in the early markets, all contributed to a cultural melting pot, preparing the ground for what was to come. The Persian soil, rich in minerals and with natural trade routes, was an invitation to exchange, forging an identity that would be cosmopolitan from the beginning. The founding of settlements like Choga Zanbil, with its imposing ziggurats rising towards the sky, testified to the growing complexity of their societies, the solidifying social hierarchy, and the intertwining of religious and political power. It was in these urban centers that the first kings and priests exercised their dominion, and the first laws were codified, creating the structure that would one day sustain vast empires. It was the awakening of a sleeping giant, the first notes of a historical symphony that would resonate for millennia. What would these first seeds of civilization blossom into? The answer would come with the arrival of even more ambitious peoples. From the mists of prehistory and the first seeds of civilization, a force emerged that would change the course of human history, the Achaemenid Empire. But before the glory and vastness there was a man, an almost mythical figure whose name echoes with the promise of a new dawn, Cyrus the Great. Legend says that Cyrus was abandoned at birth, raised by a shepherd, a narrative that connects him to the founding heroes of many civilizations. But the reality, though less fantastical, is no less extraordinary. Cyrus, a Persian leader of the Achaemenid dynasty, emerged from the kingdom of Anshan, a small but ambitious entity in southwestern Iran. It was an era of warring kingdoms, where the Medes, Babylonians, and Lydians vied for supremacy, their borders ever in flux, their alliances as fragile as glass. It was in this unstable environment that Cyrus, with a singular vision and a rare combination of military genius and magnanimity, began his rise. In the mid-6th century BC, he turned against his grandfather, Astyages, the king of the Medes, who had subjugated the Persians for generations. Cyrus's victory over the Medes was not merely a military conquest, it was an act of unification, the first stage in the creation of a unified Persian identity. What followed was a succession of audacious campaigns that redefined the map of the known world. The kingdom of Lydia, with its king Croesus famous for his legendary wealth, was the next to fall. The once impregnable walls of Sardis yielded to Cyrus's cunning and power, and the seemingly unshakable empire crumbled like sand. The treasures of Lydia, the famous gold mines, now belonged to the Persians. But Cyrus's greatest feat, the one that would seal his name in history, was the conquest of Babylon in 539 BC. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, with its hanging gardens and massive gates, was the center of a formidable empire. When Cyrus marched on it, the city seemed destined for fierce resistance. However, in a surprising move of cunning, the Persians diverted the course of the Euphrates River, allowing their troops to march under the walls along the dry riverbed. The city fell with little resistance, or so the records say. Cyrus's entry into Babylon was a watershed moment. Instead of plundering and oppressing, as was common among conquerors of the time, Cyrus adopted a policy of tolerance and respect. He freed the captive Jews, allowing them to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple, an act of benevolence that earned him praise in the Hebrew scriptures. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay artifact with cuneiform inscriptions, proclaims his policy of respect for the beliefs and customs of conquered peoples, a testament to an imperial approach unique for its time. Under Cyrus, the Achaemenid Empire became a mosaic of cultures and ethnicities, united not by the brute force of oppression, but by intelligent administration and remarkable religious and cultural freedom. The capital, Pasargadae, though modest by future standards, was a symbol of his vision, a center radiating the new Persian order. Cyrus's vision was grand, a vast but cohesive empire where diversity was a pillar, not a weakness. Persian ingenuity manifested itself in the construction of roads, the creation of an efficient postal system, and the adoption of a unified currency, facilitating trade and communication across a territory stretching from the Aegean Sea to India. Cyrus the Great not only founded an empire, he established a model of governance, a philosophy of power that contrasted sharply with the brutality of his predecessors. He was not merely a conqueror, but a builder, a statesman whose legacy would echo for millennia. His death, shrouded in legend, only solidified his mythical status. Some say he died in battle, others that he perished peacefully. But what matters is that he left behind not only a vast empire, but the seeds of a civilization that was about to reach its zenith. The foundations were laid. What would his successors do with this monumental inheritance? The answer lay in the magnificence that was to come. If Cyrus the Great was the audacious architect who laid the first outlines of the Achaemenid Empire, Darius I, who ascended the throne amidst a series of revolts after the death of Cambyses II, Cyrus's son, was the meticulous engineer who solidified and expanded this vast structure, leading it to its zenith of power and splendor. His rise was not simple, marked by intrigues and battles to assert his legitimacy. The Behistun inscription, engraved on a remote cliff, recounts in detail how Darius crushed 9 rebellious kings in 1 year, a testament to his determination and ferocity. With internal stability secured, Darius turned to administration and expansion. It was during his reign that the Achaemenid Empire reached its greatest extent, a colossus stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to the lands of Thrace and Macedonia in the west, encompassing Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. To govern such a vast and diverse territory, Darius implemented administrative reforms that would become the standard for future empires. The empire was divided into approximately 20 satrapies, provinces governed by satraps, who were carefully selected and supervised by royal inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king, ensuring loyalty and efficiency. Each satrapy was responsible for paying a fixed tribute, and collection was rigorous but fair. Darius also revolutionized imperial infrastructure. The legendary Royal Road, stretching over 2,500 kilometers, connected Susa to Sardis, allowing royal messengers to cover the distance in a few days, ensuring rapid communication and centralized control. Rest stops and stables along the route ensured efficiency, a postal system that would be the envy of many future kingdoms. The introduction of a standard currency, the gold darak and the silver shekel, facilitated trade and taxation, unifying the economy and boosting prosperity throughout the empire. The cultural diversity that Cyrus had embraced was cultivated by Darius. Local laws and customs were respected, as long as loyalty to the great king and the payment of tribute were maintained. This fostered a harmonious coexistence, where different languages, religions, and traditions flourished under the mantle of Pax Persica. But the crowning glory of Darius was undoubtedly the construction of Persepolis. Erected as a ceremonial capital, Persepolis was not a city for everyday living, but a monumental stage for the processions and festivities of the Persian New Year, Nowruz, where representatives from all the satrapies presented themselves before the great king. Its palaces, carved in stone, with monumental staircases and reliefs depicting the diversity of the empire's peoples bringing their tributes, were a declaration of power, a testament to Persian wealth and art. Each column, each frieze, each monumental gate of winged bulls told a story of dominion and magnificence. There, the great king received an audience, seated on his throne, a focal point of a vast universe. The complex, though never fully completed by Darius, would be continued by his successors, becoming the symbolic heart of the empire, a beacon of its greatness. Darius's legacy extended far beyond political and architectural boundaries. Persian art, with its fusion of Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek styles, flourished, giving rise to a unique aesthetic characterized by grandeur and detail. Architecture, goldsmithing, ceramics, all reached an unprecedented level of sophistication. But this golden age of Persian power, though seemingly unshakable, carried within it the seeds of a conflict that would set East and West on a collision course. Darius's ambitions extended beyond Asian borders, and the flame of his expansion would burn to the limits of Europe, where a small confederation of Greek city-states prepared to resist. What would happen when this unstoppable force encountered unexpected resistance? While the Achaemenid Empire, under Darius the Wean and later his son Xerxes I, relentlessly expanded westward, its imposing shadow covering vast territories, a small and fragmented collection of city-states on the Balkan Peninsula, known as Hellas, prepared for an epic confrontation. These were the Greeks, a people of navigators, philosophers, and warriors, who, despite their constant internal rivalries, found surprising unity in the face of the Persian threat. The Greco-Persian Wars were not merely a series of battles. They were a clash of civilizations, a clash between the vast Eastern Empire and the nascent Western democracy, a conflict that would shape the destiny of both worlds. The trigger for the first major Persian incursion was the Ionian Revolt, when the Greek cities of Asia Minor, under Persian rule, sought independence with the support of Athens. Darius, furious at Athenian interference, swore revenge. The first major Persian invasion attempt occurred in 490 BC, when a Persian fleet landed on the plain of Marathon, a few kilometers from Athens. There, the Athenian hoplites, despite being outnumbered, demonstrated superior tactics and discipline, inflicting a humiliating defeat on Darius's forces. The Battle of Marathon was a shock. The Persian colossus had been stopped, and the echo of this victory resonated throughout Hellas, instilling a sense of confidence and unity among the Greeks. But the Persian fury would not be quelled by a single defeat. 10 years later, in 480 BC, Darius's son Xerxes I led an invasion force of legendary proportions. Ancient sources speak of millions of men, an army so vast it drank entire rivers. Although the numbers are exaggerated, it was undeniably the largest military force ever seen, marching across a bridge of boats on the Hellespont, a spectacle of power and determination. Xerxes' objective was clear: to crush Greece, avenge his father's defeat, and extend Persian dominion to the ends of the known world. The first major obstacle for this Persian horde was the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a strategic bottleneck between the mountains and the sea. There, a small Greek force led by the legendary Spartan king Leonidas and his 300 elite Spartans, along with other Greek allies, resolved to resist to the last man. For 3 days and 3 nights, they held back the Persian advance, their shields and spears forming an impenetrable wall against the waves of attacks. Spartan bravery became legend, a sacrifice that bought precious time for the rest of Greece to organize. Despite the betrayal that revealed a secret passage and the final siege that decimated the defenders, the heroic act of Leonidas and his men would echo for centuries, a symbol of unwavering courage in the face of tyranny. While Thermopylae fell, the Persian fleet advanced through the Aegean Sea. But in the treacherous waters of Salamis, the Athenian naval genius of Themistocles turned the tide. The agile maneuvers and superior tactics of the Greek triremes, light and fast warships, disorganized the vast and heavier Persian fleet, inflicting a catastrophic defeat. The sound of the ships colliding, the cries of the sailors, the creaking of the wood under the force of the battering rams, all mingled in a chaos of destruction. The victory at Salamis was decisive, marking the beginning of the Persian retreat. The following year, in 479 BC, the remaining Persian forces were finally defeated at the Battle of Plataea, sealing the fate of the invasion. The Greco-Persian Wars were a turning point. The Greek victory, though achieved with immense sacrifice, not only preserved the independence of the Greek city-states, but also paved the way for the rise of Athens and the flourishing of democracy, philosophy, and art that would become the foundation of Western civilization. For the Persian Empire, the defeats were a blow to its aura of invincibility, a reminder that even Colossi can be challenged. Borders were redefined, and although the empire remained vast and powerful for another century and a half, the Greek threat, which had seemed so insignificant at first, had proven resilient. But however much the Persians had been contained in the West, they were still the greatest force in the world. What would happen if the West decided one day to take the war to the heart of the Persian Empire? The echo of the Persian Wars still resonated through the mountains and valleys of Greece, the memory of Spartan bravery and Athenian cunning etched in stone and in hearts. But as the centuries passed, a new power emerged in the north, a kingdom that, although culturally linked to the Greeks, was seen as somewhat barbaric and distant: Macedonia. And from this land, at the end of the 4th century BC, a young king ascended the throne, whose name would become synonymous with conquest, a man who would challenge the very existence of the Achaemenid Empire and redefine the map of the world: Alexander the Great. The son of Philip II, who had unified the Greek city-states under Macedonian rule, Alexander inherited a disciplined army and an ambitious vision. His tutor, the philosopher Aristotle, instilled in him a love for Greek culture and an insatiable thirst for knowledge and glory. At the age of 20 after his father's death, Alexander consolidated his power and, in 334 BC, crossed the Hellespont, following in the footsteps and mistakes of Xerxes, but with a very different intention: not only to punish, but to conquer. His goal was the total annihilation of the Persian Empire. The Achaemenid Empire, though still vast, was no longer the unified and invincible power of Darius I. Centuries of court intrigue, assassinations of kings and satraps, and a cumbersome bureaucracy had weakened its structures. On the throne was Darius III, a king who lacked the charisma and military acumen of his predecessors. Clash was inevitable. The first major confrontation occurred at the Battle of Granicus, 334 BC, where the Macedonian army, with its phalanx of long spears and elite cavalry, demonstrated its tactical superiority. The sound of clashing shields, the shouts of soldiers, the battle trumpet, all combined into a hymn of relentless advance. Victories followed. At Issus, 333 BC, Alexander faced Darius III in person. The Persian forces were numerically superior, but the narrow terrain favored Macedonian tactics, and Alexander's presence at the vanguard of his troops inspired his men to unimaginable feats of bravery. Darius III, in panic, fled the battlefield, abandoning his family and his treasures. The scene of the captured Persian royal family watching the looting of their own camp is a testament to the humiliation inflicted on the once proud empire. The route to the heart of Persia was open. But Alexander did not rush. He secured his southern flank, conquering the Phoenician cities and, crucially, Egypt, where he was acclaimed pharaoh and, in an act of political genius, founded Alexandria, a city that would become a beacon of culture and knowledge. At every step, Alexander absorbed the culture of the peoples he conquered, not only imposing Hellenization, but also adapting to certain Eastern customs, such as the use of Persian clothing, much to the chagrin of some of his Greek generals. The final confrontation took place on the vast plain of Gaugamela, 331 BC. Once again, Darius III assembled a colossal army, including war chariots with scythes and war elephants. But Alexander, with his tactical vision and the discipline of his troops, maneuvered to divide the Persian forces, concentrating his attack on the center of the enemy army. The terror of battle, the dust raised by thousands of feet, the glint of weapons under the merciless sun, all culminated in a decisive victory. Darius III fled again, but this time his flight was the seal of death for his empire. He would be assassinated by one of his own satraps shortly afterwards. With the death of Darius III, the Achaemenid Empire, which had lasted for more than 2.5 centuries, came to an abrupt end. Alexander triumphantly entered Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia. What happened next is one of the most controversial moments of his campaign: the burning of Persepolis. The flames licking the stone columns, the sound of the collapsing palaces that once echoed the power of kings. Was it an act of revenge for the burning of Athens by the Persians in the Greco-Persian Wars, or an act of drunkenness and recklessness? The debate persists. The Persian Empire was dismantled, and its vast territory was incorporated into Alexander's new Hellenistic Empire. The Greek language and Hellenic culture spread throughout the East, a phenomenon known as Hellenization. But Persia would not disappear. Though conquered, its rich culture would survive, absorbing and influencing Greek culture in a fascinating exchange. Alexander had conquered the Persian world, but he had not destroyed its soul. What would rise from the ashes of this colossus? A new chapter was about to be written. With the sudden death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, his vast empire, built in less than a decade, rapidly disintegrated, divided among his generals in a period known as the Wars of the Diadochi. The eastern portion, including most of the former Achaemenid Empire, fell under the control of Seleucus the Fierce Nicator, one of his most capable generals, founding the Seleucid Empire. For more than a century and a half, the Seleucids attempted to maintain Hellenistic hegemony over the Iranian plateau, imposing Greek culture and institutions. But the seed of resistance was always present, fermenting in the easternmost provinces, where Hellenic influence was weaker and Persian traditions still pulsed strongly. It was in this scenario of tension between Greek culture and the persistence of Iranian identity that a new force emerged, a people of nomadic warriors originating from the steppes of Central Asia, the Parthians. Originally an Iranian tribe known as the Parni, they settled in the eastern province of Parthia, hence their name, in the 3rd century BC. Under the leadership of Arsaces I, they rebelled against Seleucid rule around 247 BC, establishing a dynasty that, over the centuries, would expel the Greeks and restore Iranian power. The rise of the Parthians was gradual, a process of assimilation and conquest, where military cunning and cultural adaptation proved more effective than brute force. The Parthian military tactics were legendary, centered on their heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, fully armored horsemen, and their mounted archers, who executed the famous Parthian arrow, firing backward as they retreated, confusing and decimating their pursuers. The sound of hooves in the desert, the whizzing of arrows in the air, the glint of bronze and iron under the relentless sun, all this composed the image of a formidable military force, adapted to the vast and challenging Persian terrain. As the Seleucids weakened due to internal conflicts and pressures from other frontiers, the Parthians expanded methodically. Under kings like Mithridates, for 171–138 BC, who conquered Mesopotamia and Ctesiphon, which would become its capital, the Parthian Empire established itself as one of the greatest powers of the ancient world, controlling the lucrative Silk Road routes that linked the Roman Empire to the Chinese Empire. Gold, silk, spices, and ideas flowed through their territory, making them immensely wealthy and influential. But Parthian glory came at a price: the inevitable clash with another rising superpower in the West, the Roman Empire. For the next 3 centuries, Parthians and Romans would engage in a nearly uninterrupted series of wars, a titanic conflict that would define the borders of the Near East. The first major Roman defeat occurred at Carrhae, 53 BC, when General Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, led an army that was annihilated by Parthian horse archers. The Roman eagles, symbols of the legion, were lost, a humiliation Rome would never forget. The sound of Roman drums, the clamor of the legions, the clash of swords, all turned to despair in the face of Parthian tactics. Despite some occasional Roman victories, Parthia proved to be a formidable adversary. Its borders, though flexible, were protected by their vast extent and the ability of its armies to operate on their own terrain. Cities like Hatra, a Parthian stronghold in the desert, withstood Roman sieges, symbolizing Parthian tenacity. Parthian art and culture, while influenced by the Hellenists and Romans, developed a distinct style, with an emphasis on portraiture and visual narratives that celebrated their kings and heroes. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion, continued to be practiced alongside other beliefs, reflecting religious tolerance, though with less prominence than in the later Sasanian period. The Parthian Empire, which lasted almost 500 years, was a bridge between the Hellenistic legacy and the Persian Renaissance that was to come. They demonstrated that the Iranian spirit, though subjugated, could never be extinguished. They were the guardians of Persian identity in a world dominated by Greco-Roman culture, proving that Persia was not merely a battlefield, but a center of power and resistance. But Parthian power, however enduring, was not immune to internal and external tensions. A new dynasty, with an even stronger claim to the Persian legacy, was about to rise, setting the stage for a new chapter of glory and conflict. What awaited the Parthian Empire on the horizon? While the Parthian Empire, though powerful, struggled against Roman pressures in the west and internal tensions in the east, a new flame began to crackle in the heart of Persia, fueled by the aspiration to restore the ancient Achaemenid glory. At the beginning of the 3rd century AD, a family of priests and nobles from the province of Fars, the cradle of the ancient Achaemenids, initiated a movement that would sweep across Parthia and inaugurate one of the most brilliant and influential eras in Iranian history, the Sasanian Empire. Its founder, Artaxerxes I, a descendant of Sasan, claimed the Persian throne for himself, asserting himself as the rightful heir of the ancient kings. In 224 AD, at the Battle of Hormizdagan, Artaxerxes defeated Artabanus IV, the last Parthian king, and sealed the fate of the Arsacid dynasty. With the Sassanid rise, Persia experienced an unprecedented cultural and political renaissance. Unlike the Parthians, who retained some Hellenistic influences and adopted a more decentralized structure, the Sassanids embraced a strong Persian nationalist ideology and centralized power, consolidating an efficient bureaucratic administration. The sound of new coins, minted with the profiles of Sassanid kings and Zoroastrian symbols, echoed the new order. The capital, Ctesiphon, on the banks of the Tigris, became one of the largest and most opulent urban centers of the ancient world, a direct rival to Rome and Constantinople, its domes and palaces reflecting the brilliance of a new era. The ideological and spiritual pillar of this renaissance was Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian monotheistic religion, which experienced a revitalization under the Sasanians. Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of good, and Ahriman, the spirit of evil, were the poles of a cosmic struggle that permeated life and politics. The Sasanian kings saw themselves as defenders of the faith, and the Zoroastrian priests, the Magi, gained immense power and influence. Fire temples, where sacred flames burned incessantly, were built and protected, and Zoroastrian rituals became an integral part of imperial life, with their chants and incense filling the air. The compilation and codification of the sacred texts, the Avesta, was a monumental undertaking, solidifying the foundations of the religion. Militarily, the Sassanids were formidable. They inherited and improved the Parthian cavalry, transforming it into an elite shock force capable of confronting and often defeating Roman legions. Centuries of conflict with Rome continued, but now with renewed vigor. Kings like Shapur I, 240–270 AD, inflicted crushing humiliations on the Romans, even capturing a Roman emperor, Valerian, in 260 AD. The relief at Nakshi Rustam, showing Shapur triumphant over the kneeling Roman emperor, is a visual testament to their supremacy, a vivid reminder of the reversal of power. Sasanian art and architecture reached new heights of sophistication. Monumental arches, colossal vaults, the richness of mosaics and metalwork, all demonstrated a unique aesthetic that would influence later Islamic art. The Palace of Ctesiphon, with its grand Tak Khazra, Arch of Khosrau, the largest unsupported brick arch in the ancient world, was a marvel of engineering and beauty. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, all flourished under royal patronage, with the Sasanians absorbing knowledge from Rome, India, and China, and translating important texts into Middle Persian, Pahlavi. The Sasanian Empire was the last great pre-Islamic Persian empire, a period of great cultural, political, and military flourishing. They kept the flame of Persian identity alive for over 4 centuries, defending their borders, cultivating their traditions, and creating a civilization that rivaled the splendor of their Western enemies. But, like every great saga, this one too would have its end. The incessant wars with Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, exhausted both empires, leaving them vulnerable to a new force emerging from the sands of the Arabian desert. The Persian civilization, at its peak, failed to perceive the storm brewing in the south. What would happen when this new faith, born in the depths of the desert, confronted the established power of millennia? The Sasanian Empire, at its peak, was a formidable power, but centuries of exhausting wars against its arch-enemy, the Byzantine Empire, had left both giants bleeding and vulnerable. The sound of marching armies, the clang of swords, the smell of gunpowder and sweat, all this was the constant symphony of a conflict that seemed endless. While the two titans fought for every inch of border, an unsuspected and revolutionary force was consolidating in the south, in the arid lands of the Arabian Peninsula. It was Islam, a new monotheistic faith born from the revelations of Muhammad in the 7th century AD, which was not just a religion, but a unifying political and social movement, capable of transforming fragmented tribes into a cohesive and fervent army. The Islamic expansion was meteoric. Motivated by a profound faith and the promise of a paradise for martyrs, the Arab armies, led by the first caliphs, swept through the region with impressive speed and efficiency. The Sasanian Empire, weakened by plague, dynastic disputes, and the disillusionment of a population burdened by taxes and military conscription, was unprepared for the approaching fury. The once impenetrable defenses crumbled under the impact of the Arab cavalry. The first major blow came at the Battle of the Bridge, 634 AD, where the Persians initially achieved a Pyrrhic victory, but this was only the prelude to disaster. The true catastrophe for the Sasanians occurred at the Battle of Qadisiyah, 636 AD, on the banks of the Euphrates. Under the command of the Arab general Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the Muslims faced the colossal Sasanian army, led by General Rostam Farrukhzad. For 4 days, the desert echoed with the clash of thousands of men and horses. The cry of Allahu Akbar, God is great, from the Muslim warriors contrasted with the Zoroastrian chants of the Persians. The loss of the legendary Sasanian banner, the Derafsh Kaviani, and the death of Rostam were signs of an impending collapse. The defeat at Qadisiyah opened the doors to the conquest of Mesopotamia, and soon Ctesiphon, the glorious Sasanian capital, fell in 637 AD, its vast treasures falling into the hands of the conquerors. The fall of Ctesiphon did not signify the end of Persian resistance. Yazdegerd III, the last Sasanian emperor, attempted to rally the remaining forces, seeking support from other provinces. But defeats followed, culminating in the Battle of Nihavand, 642 AD, known as the Victory of Victories for the Arabs. It was there that the last great Sasanian army was annihilated, sealing the fate of the empire. The sound of despair from the Persian warriors, the clamor of pursuit, and the final silence that fell upon the battlefield marked the end of a 1,000-year era of pre-Islamic Persian empires. Yazdegerd III, the last of the Sasanian line, became a fugitive, seeking refuge until he was assassinated in Merv, in the east, in 651 AD, bringing a melancholy end to the glorious dynasty. The Islamization of Persia was a complex process that lasted centuries and was not achieved solely by the sword. Initially, many Persians continued to practice Zoroastrianism, but the advantages of converting to Islam, such as exemption from additional taxes, jizya, and participation in the new elites, gradually encouraged conversion. Persian culture, however, was not eradicated. On the contrary, it merged with Islamic culture, enriching it in profound ways. The Persian language, although adopting the Arabic alphabet, maintained its structure and vocabulary, becoming modern Persian, one of the most beautiful languages in the Islamic world. Persian cities, such as Isfahan and Shiraz, maintained their vitality, transforming into centers of Islamic learning and art. The arrival of Islam in Persia marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Sasanian Empire, with its Zoroastrianism and imperial culture, had succumbed, but the essence of Persian identity would persist, adapting and, in many respects, shaping Islamic civilization itself. What seemed like cultural annihilation was, in fact, the prelude to a new golden age, where the Persian contribution to the Islamic world would be as vast as its millennia-long history. Persia had fallen, but it would be reborn in a new guise. What would this fusion of cultures bring to the world? The fall of the Sasanian Empire and the arrival of Islam in Persia did not signify the end of the brilliant Persian culture. Far from it. What followed was one of the most extraordinary cultural fusions in history, a period known as the Islamic Golden Age, in which Persian civilization, far from being subjugated, became one of the main driving forces of knowledge, innovation, and art throughout the Muslim world. The Abbasid Caliphate, which moved its capital to Baghdad, a city founded on lands that once belonged to Sasanian Persia, embraced and encouraged this intellectual effervescence, absorbing Persian talent into its courts and academies. Imagine the streets of Baghdad or Persian cities like Nishapur, Shiraz, and Isfahan, teeming with the bustle of scholars, merchants, and artisans. The aromas of spices and ink mingled in the air, while ancient manuscripts were copied, and new ideas were debated under the bright stars of the East. The Abbasid caliphs, with their cosmopolitan vision, sponsored the translation of Greek, Indian, and Persian texts into Arabic, creating a vast repository of knowledge. This was the House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah, in Baghdad, a center of translation and research that became the beating heart of intellectual life. It was in this vibrant environment that the Persians, many of whom had converted to Islam but remained deeply rooted in their cultural heritage, made invaluable contributions to all areas of knowledge. In medicine, figures such as Avicenna ibn Sina, born in Persia, author of the monumental Canon of Medicine, whose principles guided medical practice for centuries, both in the East and the West. His work, which described diseases, anatomy, and pharmacology, was translated and studied in European universities until the 17th century. In mathematics and astronomy, the Persians were pioneers. Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave rise to the term algorithm, was one of the fathers of algebra, developing systematic methods for solving equations that revolutionized arithmetic. Persian astronomical observatories were the most advanced of their time, and figures like Omar Khayyam, better known for his poetry, were also brilliant mathematicians and astronomers who developed a Persian calendar more accurate than the Julian calendar. The precision of his celestial measurements and the complexity of his equations were the result of tireless intellect and boundless curiosity. Persian philosophy, which had already flourished under the Sassanids with Neoplatonism, found new expressions within Islam. Philosophers such as Al-Farabi and the aforementioned Avicenna attempted to reconcile Greek philosophy with Islamic principles, influencing later thinkers throughout the Islamic and European world. Their debates on reason and faith, metaphysics and ethics, were the cornerstones of the thought of the time, echoing through the corridors of the madrasas. Persian literature reached its zenith. Poets like Ferdowsi, author of the epic Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, a work of over 60,000 verses narrating the mythical and legendary history of Persia from its creation to the Arab conquest, preserved the Persian language and identity in the face of Arabization. The sound of their verses, recited in bazaars and palaces, was the soul of the nation. Other masters of poetry, such as Rumi, with his mystical Sufi poetry celebrating divine love, and Hafez, whose ghazals are still recited with reverence today, shaped the artistic sensibility not only of Persia, but of the entire Muslim world. Calligraphy, Miniature painting and Persian tapestry became exquisite art forms, celebrating beauty and spirituality. Intricate geometric patterns, vibrant colors, mystical symbolism, all combined to create works of breathtaking beauty. This golden age, driven in large part by Persian genius, not only safeguarded and expanded ancient knowledge, but also laid the foundations for the European Renaissance, whose scholars benefited enormously from translations of Arabic and Persian works. The Persian legacy in the Islamic Golden Age is a testament to a culture's ability to adapt and thrive, even under new rule, and to influence its conquerors in unexpected and profound ways. If this story of brilliance and knowledge, of resilience and innovation, surprised and inspired you, then don't hesitate. Like this video, because it helps us spread knowledge even further and bring these fascinating narratives to many more people. And if you're not yet part of our community, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming dives into history. Help us make the story resonate in every corner of the world. And tell us in the comments, from which city, from which corner of the planet, are you following this incredible journey through the heart of Persia? Your participation makes all the difference to us. Despite the splendor of the Islamic Golden Age and the theoretical centralization of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the vast and heterogeneous Islamic Empire could not maintain perfect and perpetual unity. Distances were immense, communications slow, and the ambitions of local governors and leaders were inevitable. Thus, as the centuries passed, the caliph's authority, while still respected in religious terms, began to weaken in many of the more distant provinces, especially in eastern Persia, where Arab Islamic influence was more recent and pre-Islamic Persian culture still pulsed strongly. What followed was a period of fragmentation, where various local dynasties, many of them of Persian origin, arose, establishing semi-independent or fully autonomous kingdoms, each with its own court, its own armies, and its own interpretation of power. The sound of local coins minted with the names of new rulers replaced the uniform clinking of caliphate coins, and the caliph's decrees were often received with politeness but little practical obedience. The map of Persia, which had previously shown the uniformity of Abbasid rule, became a mosaic of colors, each representing a kingdom flourishing in its own way. One of the earliest and most significant of these dynasties were the Tahirids, 821–873 AD, who ruled Khorasan, the northeastern region of Iran. Although nominally loyal to the Abbasids, they acted with great independence, setting precedents for regional autonomy. They were followed by the Saffarids, 861–1003 AD, a dynasty that began as adventurous warriors in Sistan, and under the leadership of Yaqub ibn al-Layth al-Safar, a former coppersmith, conquered vast portions of eastern Iran, and even challenged the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad itself. Yaqub's rise, a man of humble origins who became a conqueror, is a legend of strength and ambition. His armies, forged in the desert heat, were feared throughout the region. But perhaps the most notable dynasty to emerge from this fragmentation was the Samanid dynasty, 819–9999 AD. Originating from Transoxiana, present-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, they became great patrons of Persian culture, encouraging the use of Persian as a literary language, and supporting poets such as Rudaki, considered the father of classical Persian poetry. In their courts, poets recited verses that extolled the beauty of the land, the bravery of heroes, and the wisdom of kings. The cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, under their rule, became centers of learning and prosperity, rivaling Baghdad in terms of intellectual and artistic sophistication. Caravans of the Silk Road, laden with silk, spices, and paper, passed through their cities, enriching the dynasty and its subjects. Meanwhile, in western Persia and Iraq, the Buddhids, 934–1062 AD, a Shiite dynasty, rose to power, eventually controlling the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, who became a figurehead. The presence of the Buddhids, with their Shiite worldview in a Sunni caliphate, added a layer of complexity to the political and religious relations of the time, with palace intrigues and theological debates simmering in the courts. The fragmentation was not only political, It also reflected the diverse ethnic and religious groups within Persia, each seeking to assert their own identities and interests. These dynasties, though sometimes in conflict with one another, were crucial to the preservation and development of Persian identity under Islamic rule. They acted as guardians of the language, literature, and artistic traditions, ensuring that the Persian legacy was not swallowed up by Arab culture. The palaces of these dynasties, their gardens, their libraries, all were a testament to the persistence of a culture that refused to be completely assimilated. The fragmentation of power, however, also opened the doors to new invasions, and the sound of the hooves of nomadic peoples from the Central Asian steppes would begin to echo once again on the empire's borders. The Turks, a warlike people recently converted to Islam, were lurking, ready to fill the power vacuum. What would happen when this new wave of conquerors swept through Persia, finding not a unified empire, but a mosaic of warring kingdoms? The answer would come with the arrival of one of the most transformative forces in Persian history. At a time when various local dynasties flourished in Persia, each carving out its own niche of power and culture after the fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate, an unprecedented storm was brewing across the vast steppes of Central Asia. It was the beginning of the 13th century, and the world was about to witness the rise of a destructive military force that would sweep across continents, leaving a trail of ruin and transformation in its wake. The Mongols, led by the legendary Genghis Khan. The sound of thousands of horses' hooves, the guttural war cry of the cavalrymen, the whizzing of arrows that darkened the sun. It was the harbinger of calamity. The Mongol invasion of Iran, which began around 1219, was one of the most devastating in human history. Initially motivated by a trade dispute and the death of Mongol emissaries, Genghis Khan's wrath descended upon the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled much of eastern Persia. The cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Nishapur, once vibrant centers of culture and commerce, were massacred and reduced to ruins, their libraries burned, their inhabitants decimated. The smell of smoke and death hung over the ruins, a silent testament to Mongol fury. The brutality was strategic. Terror was a weapon as effective as the sword. When Genghis Khan died, his empire was divided, and Persia eventually fell under the rule of his grandson, Hulagu Khan, who in 1256 established the Ilkhanate, a Mongol dynasty that would govern Iran. In 1258, Hulagu marched on Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and sacked it so brutally that he ended centuries of Abbasid rule, a blow that dealt a profound trauma to the Islamic world. The Tigris River, legend says, ran red with the blood of the massacred and black with the ink of the books thrown into its waters. The impact of the Mongol invasions on Persia was cataclysmic. The population decreased drastically. Agriculture was devastated due to the destruction of irrigation systems, and many cities were reduced to rubble. The economic prosperity and cultural effervescence that characterized the Islamic Golden Age in Persia were brutally interrupted. Trade routes were disrupted and the silk and spice trade declined. However, amidst this destruction, the resilience of the Persian people began to manifest itself. The Mongols themselves gradually absorbed Persian culture. Many of the Ilkhans converted to Islam, and the Persian language, with its literary and administrative richness, became the language of the court. Persian artists, architects, and scholars once again found patronage, contributing to a new phase of cultural flourishing, albeit under foreign rule. The historian Rashid al-Din, a vizier of the Ilkhans, compiled a vast history of the world that included Mongol history, but also an in-depth look at Persian culture. Centuries later, at the end of the 14th century, another wave of invasions descended upon Persia, led by Tamerlane or Timur, a Turco-Mongol conqueror who saw himself as the heir to Genghis Khan. His campaigns were equally brutal, with looting and massacres that decimated entire populations, and the founding of pyramids of human skulls as a warning. Cities like Isfahan were once again the scene of unspeakable horrors. The sound of lamentations, the smell of rotting corpses, the terror in the streets. History seemed to repeat itself, bringing more suffering. But like the Mongols before him, Tamerlane and his successors, the Timurids, also became patrons of the arts and sciences, especially in cities like Samarkand, their capital, and Herat. Timurid architecture, with its grand and colorful mosques, madrasas, and astronomical observatories, is a testament to the fusion of Persian genius with imperial vision. The art of Persian miniature painting, calligraphy, and book production reached one of their highest points during the Timurid period. Persian poetry continued to flourish, with poets like Jami inspiring generations. The Mongol and Timurid invasions were undoubtedly the darkest periods in Persian history in terms of devastation and loss of life, but they also demonstrated the incredible adaptability and resilience of the Persian spirit. Persian culture, like an underground river, continued to flow, re-emerging and influencing its conquerors, shaping them and ultimately absorbing them. The scars of invasion would be deep, but the Persian identity, far from being broken, would emerge stronger and even more defined. What would emerge from this amalgam of cultures and suffering? A new era of unification was on the horizon, but it would be under a banner that would transform the essence of Iran forever. From the ashes of Mongol and Timurid devastation, and amidst the political fragmentation that still punctuated the Iranian plateau, a mystical and military movement began to gain strength in the early 16th century, promising a new order and unprecedented unification. These were the Safavids, a Sufi military order that, under the leadership of Ismail I, would forever transform the religious and political identity of Persia. The year 1501 marked a turning point. Ismail, a charismatic and ambitious young man, declared himself Shah and established the Safavid Empire, with Tabriz as its first capital. But the most profound revolution that Ismail I imposed on his newly founded empire was not merely political, it was religious. He decreed that Twelver Shi'ism would be the official religion of the state. Until then, most Persians were Sunni, although with strong Sufi influences and some scattered Shia communities. The sound of Shia clerics reciting the names of the 12 imams, the smell of incense in the new shrines, and the iconography of Shia martyrs began to permeate the daily lives of the people. This forced, sometimes brutal conversion generated resistance in some regions, but was largely successful, creating a unified religious identity that would differentiate Iran from its Sunni neighbors, such as the Ottoman Empire and the Mughals of India. This religious distinction would become a source of ongoing conflict, but also a basis for a distinct Persian national identity. The consolidation of Safavid power was not easy, requiring decades of conflict against the Ottomans to the west and the Uzbeks to the east. The Safavid armies, composed of Qizilbash, redheads, warriors loyal to the Shah, were formidable but faced powerful adversaries. The Persian frontier, now defined by Shi'ism, became a religious and political dividing line in the Islamic world. The Safavid Empire reached its zenith under the reign of Abbas the Great, 1588–1629, a visionary monarch who moved the capital to Isfahan, transforming it into one of the most dazzling cities in the world. Abbas's vision was clear: to create a prosperous empire and a cultural center that rivaled any other. The sound of builders' hammers, the smell of lime and mortar, the gleam of blue-tiled domes, all heralded the new era of splendor. The flourishing of Safavid art and architecture in Isfahan is one of the greatest expressions of Persian genius. Naqshi Jahan Square, Imam Square, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is a testament to its magnificence. One of the largest squares in the world, flanked by spectacular buildings. The Shah's Mosque, Imam Mosque, with its majestic dome and elegant minarets, adorned with intricate seven-colored tiles that shimmered under the Persian sun, was a masterpiece of engineering and beauty. The Sheikh Lutfollah Mosque, with its interior dome that changed color according to the light of day, and the Ali Kapu Palace, from where the Shah observed polo matches and festivals in the square, were other examples of Safavid opulence. The art of Persian carpet making, ceramics, calligraphy, and miniature painting reached new heights of excellence, becoming synonymous with luxury and sophistication throughout Europe and Asia. Persian gardens, with their symmetry and harmonious integration of water and vegetation, were the epitome of earthly paradise, an oasis of tranquility in a turbulent world. Trade flourished, with the Silk Road routes being revived and commerce with Europe and India expanding, bringing wealth and new ideas to the Safavid court. The Safavid Empire not only unified Iran under one flag and one faith, but also forged the modern Iranian national identity, an identity deeply shaped by Persian heritage and adherence to Shia. It was a period of great power, wealth, and beauty, a beacon of civilization in an age of constant change. But no empire is eternal, and the seeds of its decline, however much its glory may have obscured it, were being sown. The question that hung in the air was, how long would this golden age last, and what would replace it? If the Safavid dynasty was the driving force that unified Persia and shaped it with a Shiite identity, it was under the reign of Abbas I the Great, which lasted from 1588 to 1629, that the Safavid Empire reached its zenith, flourishing in an era of military power, economic prosperity, and above all, unparalleled artistic and architectural splendor. Abbas inherited an empire challenged by external enemies, the Ottomans to the west and the Uzbeks to the east, and by a disorganized and sometimes treacherous court. But with relentless determination and strategic vision, he transformed Iran into one of the greatest powers of his time. His first priority was military reform. Abbas III reorganized the army, creating a permanent and modernized force, including infantry equipped with muskets and cannons, and efficient artillery. The sound of firearms, the roar of cannons, the smell of gunpowder, all this represented a new era of warfare. He also formed regiments of ghulams, Caucasian slave soldiers converted to Islam, loyal only to the Shah, balancing the power of the Qizilbash and ensuring the discipline and effectiveness of his forces. With this new army, Abbas recovered territories lost to the Ottomans and Uzbeks, solidifying the empire's borders. But Abbas II's most visible and lasting legacy was his transformation of the city of Isfahan into the new capital, an ambitious project aimed at centralizing power and creating a metropolis that symbolized Safavid grandeur. Isfahan is half the world, was a popular saying at the time, and the city under Abbas in his suit seemed to contain a significant portion of universal beauty and knowledge. The scent of spices and flowers perfumed the bazaars, the murmur of water in the garden fountains brought freshness, and the gleam of the blue and gold tiles reflected the sunlight. The heart of Isfahan was the majestic Nakshi Jahan Square, literally image of the world, one of the largest public squares on the planet, surrounded by breathtaking buildings. On one side, the imposing Shah Mosque, now known as the Imam Mosque, with its double dome and tall minarets, covered in millions of intricately decorated tiles that changed color according to the light of day, a testament to Persian architectural mastery. On the other, the delicate Sheikh Lotfola Mosque, built for the royal family and scholars, with its mosaic-covered inner dome that evoked the feeling of being under a starry sky. At one end of the square stood the Ali Kapu Palace, the royal residence from where Abbas and his court watched polo matches, military parades, and public spectacles in the square below. At the opposite end, the vast and bustling Isfahan Bazaar, a labyrinth of streets and alleys where merchants from all over the world traded silk, carpets, jewels, spices, and works of art, bringing wealth to the empire. The sounds of the negotiations, the smell of the goods, the colorful crowds, it was a microcosm of the world. Abbas, I was a passionate patron of the arts. Persian tapestry reached an unparalleled level of sophistication and beauty, with intricate designs and vibrant colors that told stories and conveyed religious and philosophical symbols. Persian miniatures with their detailed scenes and vivid colors, illustrated manuscripts and books, each a work of art in itself. Calligraphy, ceramics, metalwork, all art forms flourished, elevating Persian culture to a new level of international renown. Trade prospered under Abbas, with the creation of royal silk and carpet manufactories, and the encouragement of trade with Europe through trading companies. The court of Abbas I was a center of scholarship and diplomacy, receiving ambassadors from diverse nations and fostering cultural exchange. His vision was of a strong, unified, and respected Iran, a beacon of civilization in a constantly changing world. Abbas I not only consolidated Safavid power, but also left a cultural and architectural legacy that is still acclaimed today as one of the most beautiful in human history. However, no matter how brilliant the peak, empires, like men, are mortal. The seed of decline, often planted in prosperity itself, would begin to germinate soon after the era of Abbas the Great. What would happen when the strong hand of the great Shah faded? The golden age of the Safavid Empire under Abbas the Great represented a peak of power, art, and prosperity, a beacon of civilization in the East. But like a flame that shines brightest before fading, the glorious Safavid dynasty began to show cracks soon after the death of its most illustrious ruler in 1629. The seed of decline is often planted in complacency and a lack of strong leadership. Abbas's successors, for the most part, lacked his vision, his military acumen, and his administrative ability. The sound of palace intrigues began to drown out the murmur of prosperity, and the scent of incense in the mosques was occasionally obscured by the smell of conspiracy. The instability in the Safavid court was a symptom of a larger problem. The power of the ulama, Shia clerics, grew exponentially, exerting ever greater influence over political and social decisions, sometimes eclipsing the authority of the Shah himself. This rise of clerical power, combined with a lack of competent military leaders, eroded the effectiveness of the central government. Corruption seeped into the empire, and tax collection, once efficient, became irregular and oppressive for the common people, generating discontent and sporadic revolts. While the empire weakened internally, external pressures intensified. The Ottomans, their old Sunni rivals to the west, and the Uzbeks to the east, continued to test the Persian borders, but the most lethal threat would come from an unexpected direction, and from a people the Safavids underestimated: the Afghans. These were warrior tribes from the east of the empire, mostly Sunni, who had been subjugated by the Safavids and resented Shiite rule and oppression. In 1709, the Afghan Ghilzai, under the leadership of Mirwais Hotak, declared their independence, and in 1722, in a surprising move of audacity and desperation, Mirwais's son, Mahmud Hotak, led an Afghan army against the Safavid capital, Isfahan. The city, once the epitome of splendor, was unprepared for a siege. The sound of terror spread through the streets, the fountains dried up, and the stench of famine became unbearable. After a brutal 7-month siege, where famine and disease decimated the population, Isfahan fell. Shah Sultan Hussein surrendered in October 1722, handing the Safavid crown to Mahmud Hotak. The scene of the surrender was a moment of profound humiliation for Persia, a sign of the end of a glorious era. The fall of Isfahan and the Afghan domination were chaotic and violent. Mahmud and his successor, Ashraf, attempted to govern Iran but faced resistance from the population and opposition from neighboring powers who seized the opportunity to seize parts of the disintegrating empire. The Ottomans invaded the West, and the Russians, under Peter the Great, advanced into the Caucasus and northern Persia, pursuing their own strategic and commercial interests. The cries of the invaders, the sacking of cities, the widespread uncertainty, all this plunged Persia into a period of anarchy. Despite the destruction and chaos, the Persian identity, forged by centuries of history and cemented by Shia faith, was not undone. Resistance emerged from figures like Nader Shah, a brilliant military leader of the Afshar tribe, who, emerging from the northeast, managed to expel the Afghans and other invaders, restoring the territorial integrity of Persia. He even proclaimed himself Shah in 1736, initiating a brief but powerful dynasty. Nader Shah is remembered for his spectacular military campaigns, including the invasion of India and the sack of Delhi, from where he brought back the famous Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor Diamond. But despite his victories, Nader Shah was a brutal and paranoid ruler, and his death in 1747 plunged Iran into a new period of civil wars. The fall of the Safavids was a stark reminder that even the most brilliant empires are vulnerable to complacency and internal weakness. Iran, disunited and exhausted, would enter a period of transition, an interregnum of instability, before a new dynasty could rise and attempt to forge a new future for ancient Persia. The Safavid flame had been extinguished, but the spirit of Persia, though wounded, still pulsed. What would be the new course of a nation searching for its identity? Following the turbulent interregnum that followed the fall of the Safavids and the death of Nader Shah, marked by civil wars and the rise and fall of short-lived dynasties, Iran finally found a new era of relative stability under the leadership of the Qajar. This dynasty of Turkmen origin rose to power in the late 18th century, with Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar consolidating control over Persian territory. He was a ruthless and cruel leader who unified the country with an iron fist after decades of anarchy, restoring Tehran as the capital. The smell of gunpowder and blood from the civil wars still lingered in the air, but the promise of a new order was beginning to emerge. The Qajar dynasty inherited an empire that had been exhausted by wars and was isolated from the rest of the world. Their reign, which would last from 1785 to 1925, would be a period of great challenges and transformations, marked by growing European influence and the first, often reluctant and painful, steps towards modernization. While Persia recovered, the European powers, mainly Russia and Great Britain, with their burgeoning industries and vast colonial empires, looked to Iran with increasing interest. Persia, with its strategic location and potential resources, although oil was not yet a central concern, became a pawn in the great game of imperialist politics. The sound of Russian troops marching towards the Caucasus and the growing presence of British ships in the Persian Gulf was a constant reminder of Iran's vulnerability. Through unequal treaties and economic concessions, the Qajar were forced to cede territories and trading rights to these powers. The loss of vast areas in the Caucasus to Russia after the Russo-Persian Wars, 1804, 1813, and 1826 to 1828, was a humiliating blow, an indelible stain on Persian sovereignty. The Treaty of Gulistan, 1813, and the Treaty of Turkmenchai, 1828, symbolized Iran's increasing submission to foreign interests. However, European influence was not only destructive, it also sowed the seeds of modernization. The Qajar, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of genuine curiosity, began to introduce reforms. Students were sent to Europe to learn about Western technology and science. The first modern hospitals and schools, some with Western curricula, began to emerge, albeit in a limited way. The telegraph, photography, railways, all these innovations began to make their way into Persia, connecting the country to the outside world in unprecedented ways. The smell of coal from the locomotives, the hum of the telegraph, these were the sounds and aromas of a world in transformation. The Qajar court, though sometimes extravagant and isolated from the suffering of its people, was also a patron of the arts. Qajar art developed a unique style, blending traditional Persian elements with European influences, especially in painting and architecture. Portraits of shahs, often with formal poses and opulent attire, are a testament to this cultural fusion. The Golistan Palace in Tehran, with its mirrored halls and elegant gardens, is an example of Qajar architecture, which attempted to emulate European grandeur without losing its Persian essence. However, the reforms were insufficient, and resistance to modernization from conservative sectors, especially the clergy, was strong. Economic concessions to foreigners generated popular indignation and protests. The most famous of these was the tobacco concession of 1890, which granted a British businessman a monopoly on the production, sale, and export of tobacco in Iran. The ensuing revolt, led by clergymen and intellectuals, demonstrated the growing strength of civil society and nationalist sentiment, forcing the Shah to revoke the concession. It was a harbinger of a greater change to come. Iran under the Qajar dynasty was a declining empire, squeezed between imperial powers and struggling to find its own path in a rapidly changing world. The Qajar monarchy, in its weakness and corruption, was inadvertently preparing the ground for a revolution that would seek to redefine the future of Persia, demanding a voice, a constitution, and an end to foreign interference. What seemed like an era of stagnation was, in fact, the prelude to a political awakening. The weakness of the Qajar dynasty, the growing interference of foreign powers, Russia and Great Britain, in the Persian economy and politics, and the widespread perception of corruption and inefficiency in the royal government, sowed deep discontent among the Iranian population in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A stench of despair and frustration hung in the air in the bazaar streets, where whispered conversations about injustice began to gain traction. Intellectuals, merchants, reformist clerics, and even members of the nascent petty bourgeoisie all felt that Persia was being sold off piece by piece. The humiliation of economic concessions to foreigners, such as the tobacco concession, had demonstrated the power of popular mobilization, but also the fragility of the Shah's power. The spark that ignited what would become known as the Constitutional Revolution was the growing arbitrariness and oppression of the government. In 1905, a series of protests erupted in Tehran, incited by an incident in which two merchants were whipped on the orders of the city's governor. The sound of the whippings in the bazaar resonated deeply with the population, and the cry for justice spread like wildfire. Hundreds of merchants and clergymen took refuge in sanctuaries, demanding reforms and the limitation of the Shah's power. This traditional form of protest, thebast, it grew in intensity. The constitutionalist movement was not homogeneous. It united a myriad of groups with different motivations. The scholar clerics, who sought to protect Islamic law and limit the Shah's tyranny, reformist intellectuals who aspired to a modern parliamentary system inspired by the West, merchants who desired stability and clear laws for commerce, and even elements of the discontented aristocracy. All, however, shared a common goal: to end the Shah's absolutism and establish a system of laws. Shah Muzaffar ad-Din Shah Qajar, a weak and ailing ruler, yielded to popular pressure and, on August 5, 1906, signed a decree establishing a national assembly, the Majlis, and promising a constitution. It was a moment of jubilation and hope for Iran, the first tangible step towards democracy in a region dominated by absolute monarchies. The sound of bells, the clamor of crowds in the streets, the feeling that a new dawn had arrived. The Persian people felt they had achieved something monumental. The constitution was quickly drafted and ratified, establishing a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament and defining civil rights. For the first time in Iran's modern history, the monarch's power would be limited by a fundamental law. The free press began to flourish, and political discussion became more open and vibrant. The smell of fresh ink in the newspapers, the passionate voices in the cafes, all this was the face of a society in ferment. However, the struggle against autocracy was far from over. Muhammad Ali Shah Qajar, who succeeded his father in 1907, was a fierce opponent of the constitution and the Majlis. With the support of Russia, which saw Persian democracy as a threat to its interests, he bombarded parliament in 1908, attempting to crush the constitutionalist movement. The sound of explosions, the smell of smoke and debris, the despair in the streets, it was a brutal setback. But the revolution would not die there. Resistance spread to several cities, and the constitutionalist forces eventually defeated the Shah, forcing him to abdicate in 1909. His young son, Ahmad Shah, was placed on the throne, and the constitution was restored. The constitutional revolution was a crucial milestone in Iranian history. Although parliamentary democracy still faced numerous challenges, and foreign interference remained a persistent shadow, it planted the seeds of the idea of popular sovereignty and the limitation of royal power. It demonstrated the Iranian people's capacity to mobilize for their rights and laid the groundwork for future struggles for freedom and justice. The flame of revolution had been lit, and even if intermittent, it would continue to shine, guiding the way into the 20th century, which would bring with it new revolutions and even more radical transformations. What awaited the young Persian democracy in a world on the brink of exploding into world wars? While Persia struggled to consolidate its newly acquired constitutional monarchy, shaken by political intrigue and the persistent threat of autocracy, a new element would enter the scene, one that would forever change the country's destiny and place it at the center of global geopolitical disputes: oil. The story of the discovery of black gold in Iran is a saga of persistence, opportunism, and ultimately, an exploitation that would shape the country's relations with Western powers for more than a century. The smell of mud and sweat, mixed with the sweet and strange scent of mineral oil, began to permeate the air of the desolate lands of the Southwest. Long before the world understood the true importance of oil, a British adventurer named William Knox D'Arcy obtained a concession from Shah Muzaffar ad-Din in 1901. This incredibly vast concession granted Darcy exclusive rights to explore for oil across almost all of Persian territory for 60 years, in exchange for a paltry sum of money and a small percentage of the profits, 16%. Believe me, few decisions in Iranian history would have such monumental consequences. The sound of jeeps and drills piercing the arid earth was the prelude to immeasurable wealth that would flow away from the Persian people. For years, Darcy's attempts to find oil were frustrating, consuming his fortune and the patience of his investors. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. But then, on May 26, 1908, in a remote area known as Masjid Soliman in southwestern Iran, the drill finally struck a vein. Oil gushed forth, a geyser of wealth that would change the course of Iranian history forever. It was the first major oil field in the Middle East, a harbinger of what would become one of the richest hydrocarbon regions on the planet. Following this discovery, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, was founded in 1909, later becoming British Petroleum, BP. The British government, recognizing the strategic importance of oil for its navy, which was converting from coal to oil, bought a majority stake in APOC in 1914, essentially making it a British state-owned company. Iran, which had barely recovered from autocracy and was seeking to build a democracy, saw its main natural wealth come under the control of a foreign power. APOC's oil exploration was a source of immense frustration for Iranians. Although the company generated colossal profits, Iran's share was minuscule. The company controlled its own roads, ports, and even its own police force, operating as a state within a state, with little regard for Persian sovereignty or the living conditions of Iranian workers. The smell of diesel and grease, the sound of incessant machinery, the murmur of the colonies of British expatriates living in luxury, while Iranians toiled in precarious conditions. The disparity was glaring, and the sense of injustice grew with each passing day. World War I and the Russian Revolution of 1917, which eliminated Russia as an imperialist actor in Persia for a time, deepened Iran's dependence on Great Britain. British policy in Iran focused on protecting oil fields and access routes, ensuring its vital supply. The very fragility of the Qajar monarchy and Iran's internal political instability made the country even more vulnerable to external manipulation. The discovery of oil and its subsequent exploitation by Western powers was a watershed moment. Iran was catapulted into the global geopolitical arena, not by its own will, but by its subsoil wealth. From that moment on, Iran's modern history would be intrinsically linked to the issue of oil and its sovereignty over this vital resource. The struggle for control of oil would become a decades-long saga, leading to coups, revolutions, and sanctions. Persia had found an inexhaustible source of wealth, but also a curse that would place it at the center of an international storm, with consequences that would last to this day. What would Iran do to reclaim its sovereignty over this wealth? Amidst the political turmoil and growing foreign influence that marked Qajar Iran, and in the shadow of a post-World War I world where ancient empires crumbled and new powers emerged, an ambitious and charismatic figure of military origin would rise to redefine the destiny of Persia. Reza Khan, an officer in the Persian Cossack Brigade, orchestrated a coup d'état in 1921 that deposed the weak Qajar dynasty, ending centuries of declining royal rule. In 1925, after a period of regency, he proclaimed himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding the Pahlavi dynasty, and inaugurating an era of radical modernization and centralization of power. Reza Shah viewed Iran as a backward country, humiliated by foreign interference and trapped in ancient traditions. His model was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's Turkey, a strong, modern, secularized, and nationalist state. His vision for Iran was that of a powerful, independent, and respected nation, capable of defending itself and competing with Western powers. The sound of royal decrees, the smell of cement and iron from new constructions, the bustle in schools and factories. It was the sound and smell of a country undergoing forced transformation. Reza Shah's forced modernization was comprehensive. He implemented drastic reforms to strengthen the central state and modernize society. Military. The army was professionalized and modernized, with the purchase of weapons and the training of officers, becoming a respectable force capable of imposing central authority throughout the territory. The parade of troops, the sound of bugles, the discipline in the barracks, all this exuded a new strength. Infrastructure. Vast infrastructure projects were initiated, including the construction of the Trans-Iranian Railway, which linked the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, a monumental feat of engineering that improved communication and the transport of goods. Highways, ports, and factories were also built, boosting the economy. Education. The education system was modernized and secularized. New schools and universities were established, including the University of Tehran in 1934, and students were sent abroad for training, creating a new educated elite. The literacy rate, although still low, began to increase. Judicial. The justice system was reformed, replacing traditional Islamic laws with a more secularized civil and penal code, inspired by Western models. Secularization. This was one of the most controversial reforms. Reza Shah imposed measures to reduce the influence of the clergy in westernized society. He banned the wearing of the veil, chador, for women in public in 1936, encouraged the wearing of Western clothing, and promoted coeducationalism. The smell of broken taboos, the murmur of disapproval among conservatives, the glimmer of freedom for some, imposition for others. Persian society was in cultural turmoil. Nationalism. Reza Shah promoted strong Iranian nationalism, seeking to revive the glory of pre-Islamic Persia. He changed the country's name from Persia to Iran in 1935, emphasizing its Aryan heritage and its independence from Arab influences. This modernization, however, was imposed from the top down. With authoritarianism and repression, there was no room for dissent or political opposition. The press was censored, political parties were banned, and opponents were imprisoned or exiled. The sound of the secret police's footsteps, the whisper of fear among dissidents. Modernization came at a heavy cost to civil liberties. Alignment with the West was a central feature of Reza Shah's foreign policy, especially with Nazi Germany before the war, to balance British and Russian influence. However, his neutrality in World War II was viewed with suspicion by the Allies, who needed a supply route to the Soviet Union via Iran. In 1941, Iran was invaded by Great Britain and the Soviet Union, forcing Reza Shah to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The era of Reza Shah was a period of radical and controversial change. He laid the foundations for a modern Iran, but he did so through an autocratic regime, sowing social and political tensions that would surface in the following decades. The seed of modernity was planted, but so was the seed of resistance against a government that was becoming increasingly distant from the aspirations of its people. What would happen when the imposition became unsustainable? With the forced abdication of Reza Shah in 1941, amidst the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran during World War II, his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, ascended to the throne. The country was in a period of transition, with greater political openness and the return of some freedom of the press. However, the seed of foreign interference, planted with the discovery of oil and the legacy of his father, remained. The young Shah, initially perceived as a weak and easily influenced figure, would eventually consolidate power that, while seeking to modernize Iran, would become increasingly autocratic, paving the way for his own downfall. The following decades were marked by a continuous struggle between Iran's desire to control its own resources and persistent Western influence. The climax of this tension came with the nationalization of the oil industry in 1951 by the popular Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The sound of street protests, the clamor for sovereignty, the nationalization of oil echoing like a cry for freedom. Mossadegh became a national hero, defying the British and American powers. However, this audacity came at a high price. In 1953, a coup orchestrated by the CIA and British MI6 overthrew Mossadegh, restoring Mohammad Reza Shah to absolute power. The silence that followed the coup, the fear that spread, was a grim reminder of who really held the reins. With the unwavering support of the United States, the Shah embarked on an ambitious modernization program known as the White Revolution, launched in 1963. It was a set of top-down social and economic reforms designed to transform Iran into an industrialized and prosperous nation, following the Western model, and to strengthen the Shah's support base by weakening the landowners and the conservative clergy. The smell of gasoline and machinery, the hum of factories, the gleam of skyscrapers rising in Tehran. It was the face of progress, but for many, a soulless progress. The main pillars of the White Revolution included land reform. Large land holdings were distributed among peasants, aiming to modernize agriculture and create a support base in the countryside. However, the implementation was flawed, and many peasants ended up without enough land to support themselves, migrating to the cities. Nationalization of forests and pastures. These resources were placed under state control. Sale of state-owned industries. To finance development, some state-owned companies were privatized. Women's suffrage. Women gained the right to vote and were encouraged to participate in public life, a measure that shocked conservative sectors of the clergy. The sound of the female voice, once silenced, began to echo in new spaces. Literacy Corps. Young people were sent to villages to teach reading and writing, combating illiteracy. Health and Reconstruction Corps. Initiatives to improve rural health and infrastructure. Despite some visible economic and social improvements, Iran became a regional power, a major oil exporter, and the quality of life improved for some segments of the population. The White Revolution had a dark side. Political repression. The Shah, paranoid about the opposition and determined to maintain absolute control, used Savak, his secret police, to silence any form of dissent. Arbitrary arrests, torture, and executions were common. The whisper of fear, the sound of Savak cars patrolling the streets at night. Modernization came at a terrible cost to individual liberties. Despite his image as a modernizing and pro-Western leader, Mohammad Reza Shah alienated large segments of Iranian society. Conservative religious figures opposed forced secularization and Western influence, seeing the Shah as a foreign puppet. Intellectuals and the middle class, who longed for greater political freedom, were frustrated by the autocracy. Peasants, who did not fully benefit from land reform, felt marginalized. The cry of inequality, the stench of injustice, the social polarization, all accumulated like a perfect storm. The enormous rise in oil prices in the 1970s, which brought unprecedented wealth to Iran, only accelerated the process. Instead of being distributed equitably, the money was often mismanaged, exacerbating corruption and social disparity. Rapid modernization, without corresponding political reforms, created a dangerous mismatch between the population's expectations and the reality of an increasingly oppressive regime. The pomp and circumstance of the 2500th anniversary of the Persian monarchy in Persepolis in 1971, an opulent and extravagant event for world leaders, contrasted starkly with the poverty of much of the population, further fueling resentment. The Shah, in his pursuit of a glorious and modern Iran, had become the architect of his own ruin. What would happen when pent-up frustration finally exploded? The 1970s, which should have been the peak of prosperity and stability for Mohammad Reza Shah's Iran, with the country swimming in petrodollars, actually turned into a bubbling cauldron of dissatisfaction and social polarization. The 1973 oil crisis, which multiplied the price of a barrel of oil, injected unprecedented wealth into Iran's coffers. The sound of astronomical figures, the scent of unimaginable economic power. The Shah, with his Western advisors, believed that money would solve all problems and accelerate modernization at an even more frenetic pace. He dreamed of transforming Iran into a world power, a fifth largest power by the end of the century. However, this sudden and colossal wealth, instead of calming tensions, exacerbated them. The economy, attempting to absorb such a large amount of money in such a short time, overheated. Inflation skyrocketed, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary families and generating widespread frustration, especially among the poorest. The cost of living in the cities, which received the bulk of the investment, became unbearable for the working class. The scent of prosperity for some contrasted sharply with the bitter taste of inflation for many. Furthermore, the distribution of this new wealth was extremely unequal. The elite connected to the Shah and state industries amassed fortunes, while a large part of the population, especially in rural areas and urban peripheries, continued to live in precarious conditions. The ostentation of the Shah's court, with its luxurious banquets and exorbitant purchases in the West, contrasted brutally with the poverty and lack of opportunities for the majority. The sight of the opulence of the rich, the sound of parties in palaces, fueled a deep resentment. The forced modernization and secularization of Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah had also created a chasm between the government and vast sectors of society. The Shiite clergy, guardians of Islamic traditions and values, viewed Western influence with growing alarm, considering it corrupting and anti-Christian. Social reforms, such as women's suffrage and the promotion of Western clothing, were perceived as a direct attack on religious principles. The sound of sermons in mosques, the voices of the Ayatollahs echoing the concerns of the people, religious opposition gained strength, transforming mosques into centers of dissent. The Shah's political repression, carried out by the dreaded Savak, was ruthless. Any form of opposition, whether from students, intellectuals, trade unionists, or clergy, was brutally silenced. Imprisonment, torture, and executions were commonplace, and the absence of freedom of expression and democratic institutions meant that popular discontent had no legitimate outlets. The whisper of fear, the sound of screams in the dungeons, the stench of injustice, all contributed to an atmosphere of silent yet palpable terror. In this scenario, opposition to the Shah became polarized along several fronts. Conservative clergy, led by the charismatic Ayatollah Ruhollah Khamenei, exiled in Iraq and later in France, who became the most powerful and unifying voice of the opposition. His messages, recorded on cassette tapes and distributed clandestinely, echoed through bazaars and mosques, denouncing the Shah as a puppet tyrant of the West, promising social justice and an Islamic government. The sound of Khomeini's voice, choked with emotion but firm in its condemnation, was a call to action. Intellectuals and students, left-wing, Marxist, and westernized liberal groups who fought for democracy, human rights, and social justice, although their voices were often silenced by Savak. Bazaar merchants, the traditional class of merchants, who felt squeezed by large industry and government-controlled corporations, and who had historical ties to the clergy, joining the religious opposition. Discontent grew exponentially. Small, isolated protests began to erupt, transforming into increasingly larger mass demonstrations. The Shah's government, isolated from its own people and relying only on Savak and the army, could no longer contain the tide of discontent. The shouts of the crowd, the smell of tear gas, the sound of gunfire, the streets of Iran were transformed into symbolic battlefields. The Shah, in his ivory tower, seemed incapable of understanding the depth of the resentment he had generated. The question that hung in the air was, how much longer could the throne, built on oil wealth and brute force, hold on to a nation that yearned for justice and a return to its identity? The answer would come soon, and explosively. The growing wave of popular discontent, fueled by the Shah's autocracy, forced secularization, economic inequality, and brutal Savak repression, reached a boiling point in the late 1970s. What began as sporadic protests and isolated strikes quickly transformed into a cohesive and unstoppable mass movement, uniting diverse factions under a single banner, that of the charismatic exiled religious leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The smell of revolt, the sound of Allahu Akbar, God is great, echoing from the rooftops at night, was the prelude to the approaching storm. The spark that ignited the revolution was the publication of a defamatory article against Khomeini in a state-run newspaper in January 1978. This provoked student demonstrations in Qom, which were violently repressed, resulting in deaths. According to Shiite traditions, 40 days after the death of martyrs, new memorial ceremonies are held, leading to further demonstrations in Tabriz and other cities, again repressed, creating a vicious cycle of mourning, revolt, and repression that spread throughout the country. The blood spilled in the streets fertilized the soil of the revolution. The year 1978 was a crescendo of events. Strikes paralyzed the economy, including the crucial oil industry, depriving the regime of its main source of revenue. Massive demonstrations, with millions of people in the streets, took place in Tehran and other cities, demanding the overthrow of the Shah and the return of Khamenei. The brutality of the Shah's army, which opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, as on Black Friday in September 1978, when hundreds were killed in Jaleh Square in Tehran, only served to further radicalize the population, eroding any remaining legitimacy of the regime. The sound of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, the smell of blood, the Shah's violence sealed his own fate. Khomeini's appeals, smuggled in on cassette tapes from Paris, where he had moved from Iraq, resonated with the frustration and aspirations of the Iranian people. He promised justice, independence from foreign influence, and a government based on Islamic principles. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, isolated, ill, and without the unconditional support of his Western allies, especially the U.S. under the Carter administration, which championed human rights, realized he could no longer maintain control. The certainty that his fate was sealed haunted him. On January 16, 1979, in one of the most dramatic moments in modern history, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran, ostensibly for a vacation, but in reality never to return. The sound of the jet taking off, the relief on the faces of the crowd, the feeling that a nightmare had come to an end. It was a moment of national catharsis. 2 weeks later, on February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini made his triumphant return to Iran, landing at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran, where he was greeted by millions of ecstatic people. The scent of flowers, the clamor of the crowd, the image of Khomeini descending from the plane. It was a historic moment, the consecration of a revolution. The collapse of the Shah's provisional government was swift and complete. On February 11, 1979, the army declared neutrality, and the revolution was victorious. On April 1, 1979, after an overwhelming referendum, Iran was officially declared an Islamic republic, a new system of government based on wilayat-e-faqih, under the tutelage of the Islamic jurist. It was established with Khomeini as the supreme guide, the highest authority in the country. The Islamic Revolution was a seismic event, not only for Iran, but for the entire Middle East and the world. It toppled a 2,500-year-old monarchy and established a theocratic government, challenging the Western premise that modernization would inevitably lead to secularization and liberal democracy. Iran had become a revolutionary experiment, a society seeking to redefine itself based on Islamic principles. But the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, both internal and external, and the revolution, which promised freedom and justice, would soon face its own tensions and crises. The world watched apprehensively as the newly born Islamic regime took its next steps. The 1979 Islamic Revolution was not merely an internal event. It reverberated throughout the world, sending shockwaves that would alter geopolitical relations for decades. The fall of the Shah, a key U.S. ally in the Middle East, was a severe blow to American foreign policy, but what followed would transform the relationship between the newly born Islamic Iran and the Great Satan, as Khomeini referred to the U.S., into a deep and lasting hostility. The stench of anger, the sound of death to America echoing through the streets of Tehran, was a grim prelude. On November 4, 1979, a group of radical Iranian students, calling themselves the Imam Line students, stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. Their motivation? To protest President Jimmy Carter's decision to allow the deposed Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to enter the U.S. for medical treatment. For the Iranian revolutionaries, this was proof of an American conspiracy to reinstate the Shah, a fear rooted in the memory of the 1953 coup. The students took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage, demanding the Shah's extradition to Iran and a formal apology for American crimes against the Iranian people. The sound of sirens, the clamor of the crowd outside the embassy walls, the images of the burning American flag and the blindfolded hostages displayed in public, all of this captured the world's attention. The American hostage crisis would last 444 days, becoming a symbol of Iranian revolutionary fury and a profound trauma for the United States. For Iran, the takeover of the embassy, which Khomeini called a nest of spies, was an act of asserting national sovereignty and a categorical rejection of Western influence. For the U.S., it was an unacceptable humiliation, a flagrant violation of international law, and a direct challenge to its status as a superpower. The American government tried several approaches to resolve the crisis. Diplomatic negotiations were initiated, but they ran into Iranian intransigence and the complex post-revolutionary power structure. In April 1980, President Carter authorized Operation Eagle Claw, a military rescue mission. The sound of helicopters in the desert, the tension on the soldiers' faces, it was a high-risk gamble. However, the operation was a catastrophic disaster. Mechanical problems and a sandstorm caused helicopters to crash, resulting in the deaths of 8 American servicemen and the abandonment of the mission. The smoke from the burning aircraft, the smell of kerosene and frustration, was a further blow to American credibility and a propaganda triumph for the young Islamic Republic. The hostage crisis became a decisive factor in the 1980 U.S. presidential election, contributing to the defeat of Jimmy Carter and the election of Ronald Reagan. The hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, the same day as Reagan's inauguration, after intense negotiations mediated by Algeria. They had spent more than a year in captivity, a period of uncertainty and isolation that left deep scars. The consequences of the American hostage crisis were profound and lasting. It cemented mutual distrust and hostility between Iran and the United States, shaping relations between the two countries for decades. For Iran, the crisis reinforced anti-American and anti-Western rhetoric, which became a fundamental pillar of revolutionary ideology. The image of America as a relentless enemy, the Great Satan, took root in popular and political consciousness. For the U.S., the crisis led to a reassessment of its foreign policy and a determination not to allow such humiliation to be repeated. The economic sanctions imposed on Iran during the crisis would be only the beginning of a regime of pressure that persists to this day. Iran, fresh from an internal revolution, now found itself in direct confrontation with the world's greatest superpower. But, as if the tension with the U.S. wasn't enough, a new and even bloodier threat was about to emerge on its western border, one that would test the resilience of the young Islamic Republic in an unimaginable way. A relentless and brutal war awaited on the horizon. While the young Islamic Republic of Iran was still consolidating internally and dealing with the aftermath of the American hostage crisis, a new and devastating threat would emerge on its western border, one that would plunge the nation into one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. On September 22, 1980, Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, launched a full-scale invasion of Iran. Saddam had several motives: to exploit the perceived weakness of post-revolutionary Iran, to annex the rich oil fields of the Iranian province of Khuzestan, to assume leadership in the Arab world, and perhaps most importantly, to contain the influence of the Islamic Revolution, which he feared could inspire Iraq's Shiite majority to rebel against his Sunni regime. The deafening sound of Iraqi planes bombing Iranian airports, the roar of tanks crossing the border, the smell of smoke and destruction, it was the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War, a conflict that would last 8 years, cost millions of lives, and transform the region. Saddam hoped for a quick victory over an isolated and disorganized Iran. However, he underestimated the mobilization capacity of the Islamic Republic and the revolutionary fervor of its people. Initially, Iraq made significant territorial gains, occupying much of Khuzestan. But Iran, under the charismatic leadership of Ayatollah Khamenei, managed to mobilize vast forces, including the regular army and the newly formed Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as well as volunteer militias. Basij, many of them were composed of teenagers and the elderly. The cry of Allahu Akbar and war, war, until victory became the motto of the resistance. The sound of prayers and calls to jihad echoed through the mosques. The war quickly devolved into a bloody stalemate, a brutal trench warfare reminiscent of the First World War, with massive frontal assaults and the widespread use of chemical weapons by Iraq, which was widely condemned internationally, but rarely effectively punished. The smell of mustard gas, the sound of the wounded's cries, the images of martyred cities like Abadan and Khorramshahr, the war was hell on earth. Both sides suffered massive losses. Millions of soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded. The economies of both countries were devastated. Iran, under Western sanctions and facing an Iraq supported by several Western, including the US and Arab powers, felt isolated. The war also had a strong ideological component. For Iran, it was a holy war to defend Shia Islam and revolution against a secular aggressor. For Iraq, it was a defense of Arab identity against Persian hegemony and religious subversion. The conflict spread to the Persian Gulf, with attacks on oil tankers, oil tanker warfare, and even directly involved Western powers, especially the US, which intervened to protect the flow of oil. The sound of exploding naval mines, the smell of crude oil spilled into the sea, the tension in the corridors of the White House. The conflict was escalating dangerously. In 1988, exhausted and under international pressure, Iran accepted UN Security Council Resolution 598, which called for a ceasefire. Khamenei, in an act of great reluctance, declared that accepting the armistice was like drinking a cup of poison, but acknowledged the impossibility of continuing the war. The consequences of the Iran-Iraq War were profound, human and material losses. It is estimated that more than 1 million lives were lost on both sides, and billions of dollars in damages were caused. Strengthening of the Revolutionary Guard. The war consolidated the power of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a dominant military and political force in Iran. Radicalization and militarization. The conflict contributed to the radicalization and militarization of Iranian society, strengthening the hardliners within the regime. Hardening of foreign policy. Iran emerged from the war with a deep sense of isolation and distrust toward Western powers and its Arab neighbors, who had supported Saddam. This would shape its foreign policy in the following decades. The rise of Saddam. The war allowed Saddam Hussein to consolidate his power in Iraq, but his later ambitions would lead to the invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf Wars. The Iran-Iraq War left a deep scar on Iran's soul, a brutal reminder of the cost of revolution and international isolation. The country had survived the war, but emerged transformed, more determined than ever to secure its safety and assert its place in the world, even if it meant continued confrontation with the West. What would Iran, isolated and grieving, do to rebuild and reassert itself? The acceptance of the ceasefire with Iraq in 1988 marked the end of an era of war, but not the end of the challenges for the Islamic Republic. The death of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the charismatic leader of the revolution and supreme guide, on June 3, 1989, was a moment of profound uncertainty for Iran. The sound of the lamentations of millions of Iranians who gathered for his funeral, the smell of tears and despair in the air, was a testament to the impact of his figure. The nation was in mourning and wondered, who would succeed the man who had overthrown a king and established a new order? The transition of power was surprisingly smooth, with the assembly of experts electing then-President Ali Khamenei as the new supreme leader. With Khomeini's death, Iran entered a new chapter, a period characterized by post-war reconstruction and the search for a new direction for the Islamic Republic, which had survived a brutal conflict and the loss of its founding leader. The smell of brick and cement in the destroyed cities, the sound of tractors and hammers, was the prelude to a country rising again. The early post-Khamenei years were dominated by the urgent need to rebuild a country devastated by war. Cities and infrastructure were restored, and the economy, although still under sanctions, began to recover slowly. President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, 1989 to 1997, known for his pragmatism, led a reconstruction effort focused on economic development and diplomacy, seeking to reduce Iran's isolation. Anti-Western rhetoric, while present, was somewhat softened. However, post-Khomeini Iran was a country of internal tensions. There was a growing division between the more conservative factions, which wished to maintain the ideological purity of the revolution and the supremacy of the clergy, and the reformist factions, which sought greater political, social, and cultural openness, and a relaxation of the restrictions imposed by the Islamic Revolution. The sound of heated debates behind the scenes of politics, the whisper of societal hopes and frustrations, the polarization was palpable. The election of Mohammad Khatami as president in 1997, a reformist who promised freedom of speech, civil rights, and an Islamic civil society, generated a wave of optimism, especially among the youth and the middle class. The Khatami years were marked by greater cultural openness, with the flourishing of independent newspapers and a more vibrant public debate. The smell of coffee in student cafes, the murmur of intellectual discussions, the feeling of a lighter atmosphere, it seemed that Iran was finally breathing. However, Khatami's reforms faced strong resistance from conservative institutions, led by the supreme leader, who held ultimate power. Many reform efforts were blocked, leading to frustration and discouragement among his supporters. Relations with the West remained complex and ambivalent. Although Rafsanjani and Khatami attempted to improve ties, mutual distrust and international concerns about the Iranian nuclear program, which was beginning to develop under the banner of peaceful use but generated Western suspicion, persisted. The inclusion of Iran in the axis of evil by President George W. Bush in 2002, following the September 11th attacks, was a blow to hopes of rapprochement, reaffirming the narrative of confrontation. The post-Khamenei period also saw Iran develop a more active regional foreign policy. The country continued to support groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine, seen as part of an axis of resistance against U.S. and Israeli influence. Iran's influence in Iraq, especially after the 2003 U.S. invasion, increased significantly, expanding its strategic reach in the region. Despite sanctions and international pressure, Iran continued to invest in its scientific and technological capabilities, especially in the nuclear field. The scent of unease in Western capitals, the sounds of tense diplomatic negotiations, the glow of centrifuges, the nuclear issue would become the focus of global attention. Iran had survived war and the loss of its founder, but the search for a new direction would be defined by its relationship with the outside world and the internal struggle between conservatism and reform. What did the future hold for this complex and resilient nation in its quest for a place in the sun? From the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Iran's complex relationship with the West, especially the United States, would be increasingly dominated by one central issue: the Iranian nuclear program. The sound of centrifuges spinning, the scent of geopolitical debate, the glint of promises of peaceful energy against the shadows of suspected atomic weapons. All this would transform Iran into a constant focus of global attention, with dramatic consequences for its economy and society. Iran has always argued that its program has exclusively peaceful purposes, aimed at generating electricity and conducting medical research. However, Western powers and Israel have expressed deep concerns that the country is seeking nuclear weapons. The escalation has been relentless. International sanctions have been intensified, aiming to stifle vital sectors such as oil and banking. Access to the global financial system has been restricted. The currency, the rial, has depreciated sharply, and inflation has soared, causing severe hardship for the average citizen. In 2015, the landmark agreement, JCPOA, brought a brief moment of optimism, but its life was short-lived. In 2018, the unilateral withdrawal of the United States under the Donald Trump administration plunged Iran into a new wave of even harsher sanctions. In response, Iran began to reduce its commitments, increasing uranium enrichment and reactivating parts of its program. The sound of disappointment gave way to the sound of urgency. What had been a shadow war reached its definitive breaking point in June 2025. After years of stalemate, the confrontation became open and direct. Israel launched Operation Lion Rising, carrying out massive airstrikes against strategic nuclear facilities and military bases on Iranian soil, even hitting the capital, Tehran. Iran did not back down and launched Operation True Promise III, firing hundreds of ballistic missiles in one of the greatest displays of force in its history. Today, in January 2026, the saga of the nuclear program and international sanctions has ceased to be merely a diplomatic dispute and has become a fight for survival. The country enters this new year with its facilities scarred by the bombings of 2025 and an economy almost entirely isolated. The question hanging over the ruins of diplomacy is more urgent than ever. What will Iran prioritize now, the reconstruction of its nuclear autonomy, or the survival of a system under maximum pressure. The atomic bomb is no longer just a ghost. It is the axis upon which the fate of Persia is being decided at this very moment. Iran today, more than 4 decades after the Islamic Revolution, is a vibrant and complex society pulsating beneath layers of theocracy, sanctions, and a millennia-old history. It is a country shaped by both revolutionary ideals and the aspirations of a largely young population seeking its place in a globalized world. However, in January 2026, this complexity reached a definitive breaking point, where the scent of modernity and tradition gave way to the scent of a new and unstoppable social awakening. Youth remains the driving force of the nation. With an average age around 30, most Iranians did not live through 1979 and grew up challenging state control through the internet and social media. They yearn for freedom and connection to the global pop world. But if in 2022, the cry of woman life freedom after the death of Mahsa Amini shook the country, what we see now, at the beginning of 2026, is a wave of protests paralyzing Iran on an unprecedented scale, uniting generations in a clamor that goes far beyond clothing or customs. Iranian culture, ever resilient, continues to flourish as a form of resistance. The films of directors like Asghar Farhadi and contemporary literature remain voices that touch the soul of a people. Music and visual arts, from urban graffiti to galleries, continue to be vital refuges. But today, the attentive silence of movie theaters has been replaced by the clamor of the streets in more than 30 provinces, where art has become direct activism. The harsh reality is that Iran faces devastating economic challenges that will reach their peak in 2026. International sanctions, exacerbated by the conflicts of 2025, have led to food inflation exceeding 70% and the rial reaching record lows. The sound of bills to pay has become a cry of despair. The difficulty of supporting a family generates a frustration that can no longer be contained. Social restrictions and repression by the morality police remain sources of tension, but now they face fierce and organized resistance. Social media has become the ultimate space for activism, connecting the youth's thirst for freedom with the urgency of economic survival. The Iran of January 2026 can no longer be reduced to simplistic headlines. It is a nation of unbreakable spirit that, tired of balancing the weight of the past with the demands of a globalized 21st century, has decided that an uncertain future is preferable to the stagnation of the present. What will this vibrant society do now that the veil of fear has been definitively torn? Iran's foreign policy in the decades following the 1979 revolution evolved from an ideological export to a pragmatic survival strategy. The country has always seen itself as a legitimate regional power, guardian of the oppressed and opponent of Western hegemony. However, in January 2026, the chessboard that Iran meticulously constructed over decades is facing its most critical moment, with the smell of gunpowder giving way to the smell of geopolitical uncertainty. For years, Iran's strategy relied on the so-called axis of resistance, a network of proxy allies used to project power and deter attacks. But the events of 2025 changed everything. Hezbollah, Lebanon, the most crucial strategic ally, emerged severely weakened from last year's clashes. The group's military infrastructure was badly damaged, reducing Iran's ability to threaten Israel's northern border, as it did before. Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Following the intense conflicts in Gaza, the operational influence of these groups was reduced to fragments, leaving Iran with less direct leverage in the Palestinian conflict. Syria and Iraq. The government of Bashar al-Assad, which for years depended on Iranian support, faces a new collapse of authority, while in Iraq, Shiite militias are under pressure both internally and externally to reduce Tehran's influence in national politics. Houthi, Yemen. Although they remain a point of friction, Iran's economic isolation in 2026 has made it difficult to maintain the flow of sophisticated supplies to the southern Arabian Peninsula. This web of alliances, which Iran viewed as an advanced defense, was put to the test during the open war of June 2025. The direct confrontation with Israel and the new, crushing Western sanctions isolated Tehran as never before. The death to America rhetoric still echoes in official rallies, but the sound that truly dominates the capitals of the Middle East today is that of a rearrangement of forces. Many Arab neighbors, once fearful, now observe an Iran struggling to maintain the cohesion of its allies while trying to heal its own internal wounds. In January 2026, Iranian foreign policy is a desperate balancing act. The challenge is no longer just projecting influence, but preventing the collapse of its regional network from dragging the regime itself into the abyss. Iran resists, asserting its sovereignty, but the world it sought to shape is changing faster than its ability to respond. What will remain of Persian influence when the smoke from the 2025 conflicts finally settles? As we contemplate Iran's future, we perceive an intricate path paved by centuries of history, shaped by an ideological revolution, and now, in January 2026, challenged by a perfect storm of internal and external pressures, the country is at a definitive crossroads. The stench of uncertainty that hangs in the air has never been so thick, mixing the resignation of millions with an urgency that did not exist before. The economy is the biggest battleground. The sanctions, which became almost total after the events of 2025, are suffocating the nation. The collapse of the rial and rampant inflation are no longer just statistics, but the sound of despair in the markets. Dependence on oil and the inability to diversify the economy have left the country vulnerable, and daily survival has become an epic struggle for Iranian families. Internally, polarization has reached its limit. The connected and vibrant Iranian youth no longer simply demands reforms. They clamor for structural change. The protests that began in December 2025 against the cost of living have transformed into a direct challenge to the authority of the system, with slogans that question the very essence of the Islamic Republic. The clash between generations is evident. While the regime fights to preserve its revolutionary identity, the people demand dignity and a place in the 21st century. In the international arena, the nuclear program remains a sword of Damocles. Following the Israeli bombings in 2025, the risk of a new military escalation is constant. Regional politics, although weakened by the erosion of its allies in Lebanon and Syria, still keeps Iran at the center of a region in turmoil. However, Iran still possesses powerful assets. Its rich cultural heritage, a young and highly educated population, and a historical resilience that has already survived Mongols and empires. The potential for prosperity is immense if the country can break its isolation and leverage its strategic position and vast energy reserves. The immediate future will depend on the regime's ability to adapt to seemingly unsustainable pressures. At 86 years old, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei faces the ultimate test of his authority amidst a succession crisis and a popular clamor for change. The journey will be arduous, but history demonstrates that Iran has a remarkable capacity to survive and reinvent itself. What will the next chapter of the Iranian saga reveal to the world? The Persian people are writing the answer now, in the streets and in the shadows of a future that can no longer be postponed. And so our journey through the millennia of Iranian history comes to an end. But the story of such an ancient and multifaceted nation never truly ends. We have traversed the sands of time, from the first settlements on the Persian plateau to this January of 2026, where modernity collides with tradition in an unprecedented whirlwind of aspirations and challenges. We have seen empires rise and fall, cities flourish in splendor and be reduced to ruins, and a people who, despite all invasions, have maintained an unwavering cultural and linguistic identity. The sound of Cyrus's trumpets has echoed through the centuries to the murmur of the streets of a Tehran that today, more than ever, yearns for a new dawn. Iran is a country of profound contrasts, the land of Cyrus's tolerance and the cornerstone of the 1979 revolution, a place of stunning natural beauty and a stage for deep scars left by wars and invasions. The Iranian saga is a mirror of the eternal struggle between autocracy and freedom. In the 20th century, forced modernization gave way to a theocratic order that today faces its ultimate survival test under the weight of crushing sanctions and the dangerous specter of a nuclear program that has altered the global geopolitical landscape. At the start of 2026, Iran's future is more uncertain than at any other time in modern history. A resilient and connected youth confronts a system in crisis, while an economy, weakened by the conflicts of 2025, struggles to provide basic necessities for its population. But to ignore the depth of this civilization would be a mistake. Iran is more than war headlines. It is the land of Rumi and Hafez, of minds that shaped universal science, and of a people who, with dignity and pride, continue to build their path amidst ashes and hope. Its history is a reminder that civilizations are living organisms, and that human resilience can overcome the most terrible adversities. What will be the next chapter of this millennia-old saga that now unfolds before our eyes? Only time, with its relentless flow, will reveal. The brilliance of its past, however, is the promise that, no matter the outcome of today's struggles, the soul of Persia will never be forgotten.